Today, we're diving into prejudice and discrimination. They're two words we hear all the time, and, they're often used like they mean the same thing. But what's really going on? Let's get into what happens inside our minds and how that plays out in the real world. So let's just get right to it with the big question. Are prejudice and discrimination the same thing? It's a super common point of confusion, but the answer is a clear and simple no. And really, understanding that difference is the key to unlocking everything else we're going to talk about. The key to understanding all of this starts right here, with this fundamental split between what happens in our minds and what happens out in the world. It's all about our thoughts versus our actions. Okay, so it breaks down just like this. Prejudice is what happens inside your head. It's totally an internal experience made up of your thoughts and your feelings. Discrimination, on the other hand, is the external part. It's the actual action of treating someone unequally. So, simply put, one is an attitude and the other is a behavior. Let's zoom in on prejudice for a second. The technical definition is the tendency to think and feel negatively about people who belong to a group that's different from your own. The absolute crucial word here is attitude. It's a prejudgment that exists entirely inside our own heads. And this internal attitude, it's really got two main parts. First, you've got cognitive prejudice. These are the stereotypes and beliefs we hold, basically the thinking part. And then there's affective prejudice, which is the feeling part, that negative, emotional gut reaction. And these two are almost always linked. The stereotypes we think often fuel those negative feelings we have, and vice versa. Now, let's talk discrimination. This is when prejudice, or PEC, even just an unfair societal rule, turns into action. It's the actual unequal treatment of a person because of their group. But here's a really critical insight. A person can discriminate without actually feeling personally prejudiced. They might just be following an old rule or going along with a system that's already in place. Okay, so if prejudice is a way of thinking, where does it even begin? To understand that, we have to look at how our brains are fundamentally wired. Let's explore the brain's shortcuts. It all starts with a simple, universal human trait. Our brains are basically categorization machines. We just can't help it. It's a survival and processing tool that's been hardwired into our psychology. And why do we do this? Well, honestly, because it makes life manageable. Just imagine if you had to analyze every single object you saw from scratch every day. It'd be exhausting. By sorting things, like food or movies or clothes, we create these mental shortcuts that help us make sense of a pretty chaotic world. It's an efficiency tool, really. But here's where it gets a little more complicated. We don't just categorize objects. We categorize people. See, our brains get really good at noticing the tiny differences in the faces we see all the time. But if we don't have a lot of interaction with people from other groups, our brains just don't develop that same skill for those faces. This can lead to something called the other race effect, where it actually becomes harder to tell individuals from another race apart. Our brain's shortcut starts lumping people together. And this leads us directly to the idea of implicit bias. These are the subtle, unconscious attitudes that, well, we all have. They're a product of our brain's shortcuts and all the societal messages we've absorbed over our lives. And what's really wild is that these biases can directly contradict what we consciously believe. We might say we believe in equality with every fiber of our being, but an unconscious bias could still affect our behavior without us even realizing it. So we've looked at the wiring inside our individual brains, but how does prejudice get baked into an entire society? Well, sociologists have some pretty powerful theories about that. Research generally points to three major sources. The first one suggests prejudice can come from our individual personalities and frustrations. The second looks at how it's learned just by being part of a culture. And the third argues it's really a product of conflict between groups. So let's unpack them. First up is the scapegoat hypothesis. Just imagine a society is facing a really serious hardship, like an economic collapse, for example. The theory suggests that people feel incredibly frustrated, but they can't fight the real, complex source of their problems. So instead, they redirect all that aggression onto a weaker, more visible target, a scapegoat group. It becomes a way to vent their anger by blaming someone else. And we've seen the absolutely devastating potential of this theory in history. In post-World War I Germany, the nation was facing economic ruin and total humiliation. The Nazi regime successfully channeled the public's immense frustration and anger toward Jewish people, creating a scapegoat for all the country's problems, and the consequences were, of course, horrific. The second major theory is all about culture. It argues that prejudice isn't something we're born with. It's learned and passed down through a society's norms and messages. For instance, when powerful authority figures express stereotypes, those ideas can become normalized. This quote from President Nixon back in 1973 is a pretty stark example of how these kinds of attitudes can be transmitted right through the social fabric. And finally, there's social conflict theory. This perspective is less about individual psychology and much more about raw power and resources. It argues that prejudice really heats up when groups are forced to compete for the same limited things. We're talking jobs, housing, political influence. In that struggle, prejudice and stereotypes become weapons, used by the dominant group to justify their position and keep others down. So, all of that brings us to the present. We've definitely seen a decline in many of the really overt forms of prejudice since World War II. But has it actually gone away, or has it just changed its clothes? You can kind of visualize this idea of a shift right here. On the left, you see overt prejudice, the blatant, socially unacceptable kind, which has arguably gone down. But then on the right, you see what some sociologists call modern racism. The theory is that prejudice hasn't vanished, it's simply evolved into a more subtle, more coded form. So what does this modern racism actually look like? Well, it generally rests on three core assumptions. First, there's the belief that serious discrimination is pretty much a thing of the past. Second, the idea that any inequality we still see today is the fault of the minority group itself, not because of systemic issues. And third, the belief that any efforts to fix that inequality, like affirmative action, are actually unfair to the majority group. So what can be done? It seems that challenging prejudice isn't just about having good intentions as an individual. Research consistently shows this really strong link between education and lower levels of prejudice. Exposure to new information, to different perspectives, and to diverse groups of people. It gives us the tools to override those mental shortcuts and cultural stereotypes we've all inherited. And that leaves us with a final and pretty challenging question. Has prejudice really declined, or have we all just gotten better at hiding it, not just from other people, but maybe, just maybe, from ourselves? It's a thought worth sitting with.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something complex, quite challenging, actually. We're looking at the systems that sort of condition us, how we think about groups we see as other. We've got a lot of source material here on prejudice, discrimination, defining it, tracking it.
It's definitely material that needs an open mind. The sources themselves flag this. Our own consciousness can sometimes, resist these ideas. But the aim isn't finger-pointing at individuals. It's about seeing the system, seeing the psychological shortcuts that shape things.
Exactly. That's the mission here, getting clear on the difference between, say, thoughts and actions, and how these maybe subtle internal biases really frame how we see the world. So we'll cover definitions, the psychology behind it, the main theories, and, importantly, how this stuff has kind of evolved more recently.
Yeah, looking at it systemically is key. We're all part of it. If we start there, the insights are, I think, much more useful. So maybe let's start with the basics, what these terms mean at the individual level.
Okay. So for individual behavior, the sources give us two main categories. First up, prejudice. This is defined as basically an individual's tendency to think and feel negatively about members of other groups. It's internal.
Yeah.
Inside your head.
Right, internal. And it has two components that are pretty tightly linked. You've got cognitive prejudice that's forming and using stereotypes, the mental filing cabinet, if you like, and then affective prejudice. That's the negative feeling, the emotional response that gets attached to that stereotype. And the sources stress these two are highly correlated. Use the stereotype, you probably feel the negativity.
Okay, so that's bucket one. Bucket two is discrimination. This is the actual behavior, overt, individual, unequal treatment based on someone's group membership. This is the action itself. And here's a really crucial point from the sources for you listening. Prejudice and discrimination. Not the same thing. They don't always go hand in hand.
Exactly. That's so important. You can feel prejudice, those negative thoughts or feelings, but consciously decide not to act on them. But the other way around is also true and maybe less intuitive. You can actually participate in discrimination without personally feeling prejudiced.
How does that work? Because that seems to take us right into the group level, the societal level where the system kicks in.
That's exactly it. That's where we run into ideology. And ideology is like a belief system, right? Often it asserts one group is inferior or superior to justify social hierarchy. stratification. And this ideology gets woven into the very fabric of society, into the culture. It's passed down through socialization, which means you kind of participate in maintaining things just by living in that culture, even if you personally don't hold conscious prejudices.
Wow, that's a big idea to grapple with, participating even if you're not consciously prejudiced. How do the sources say we can spot these systemic issues, these maybe unintentional biases in the system?
They term it institutionalized discrimination. It's systemic unequal treatment. Often it's not even intentional. It's just built into how things operate day to day. See, the dominant group usually sets the rules, defines what's normal, what's not. So the system just functions to keep that hierarchy in place, sometimes withholding rights or opportunities from other groups without anyone actively planning it that way.
So you get this powerful feedback loop then. Individual prejudice can feed the system. And the system, this institutionalized discrimination, reinforces the positions of dominant and minority groups. It keeps the ideology going.
And under pressure, under stress, you see this loop really clearly, often through scapegoating. The sources point to the discrimination against people who look Chinese in the U.S., especially early in the COVID-19 pandemic. There was that New York Times piece reporting Chinese Americans genuinely fearing for their safety because of attacks, verbal abuse.
And what's key there is how systemic fear, that anxiety about the pandemic, got channeled. It locked onto a visible group. The false idea about where the virus originated wasn't just a stray thought. It became the excuse, the ideological cover, to direct hostility towards an entire community. Systemic stress turned into individual discrimination.
Let's maybe pull back a bit now, look at the real fundamental driver, the brain itself. We should probably unpack why we even create these categories, in-groups and out-groups.
Yeah, the sources suggest our brain categorizes absolutely everything. Food, clothes, movies. It's a survival thing, right? A massive shortcut to manage the chaos of incoming information. And we just apply the same process to people, to faces, to groups.
Precisely. The faces we see most often are in-group. Our brain gets really good at noticing the small differences, the nuances. It develops that skill through repeated exposure.
But if we don't have much exposure to other groups, well, the brain doesn't build those differentiation skills for those faces. This is what they call the other race effect. Basically, your brain hasn't had the training data, so it lumps everyone in that outgroup together. They look more similar.
There's a good analogy for this. Think about any specialized skill, like someone who isn't a teacher trying to quickly tell apart a lineup of young kids. If you don't work with that age group all the time, you just haven't developed the skill to quickly spot the subtle differences. The faces kind of blur into one category, young child.
And that lack of differentiation, that connects directly to implicit bias, doesn't it? These subtle, unconscious preferences or associations, they operate without us even knowing, but they still shape our behavior, our decisions.
Oh, absolutely. They're insidious, really, because they can flat out contradict what we think we believe are conscious values. And they are measurable. The implicit association test, the IAT, is probably the most famous tool for this. Just recognizing that these biases are there, operating under the surface, that's a huge first step in tackling that institutionalized discrimination we talked about.
Okay, so we have the definitions, the basic brain wiring. Now, the sources lay out three main theoretical camps for explaining how prejudice forms and sticks around: personality, culture, and social conflict.
Right, starting with personality-centered causes. These theories look inward at the individual's psychology. These kinds of prejudices tend to be more stable, harder to change, because they're fulfilling some kind of personal psychological need for that individual.
The classic example here is the scapegoat hypothesis, yeah. It connects prejudice to someone needing to deal with their own frustration, maybe displacing aggression, like you're angry about something else, something you can't control, so you find a safer target, an outgroup, to lash out at.
Exactly. Historically, you could look at something like anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany through this lens: economic hardship, national humiliation, channeled onto a specific group. The limitation, though, is that it often looks at the individual in a vacuum, separate from the social forces around them.
And beyond just raw frustration, personality also involves that cognitive dimension we mentioned, the need to categorize. Stereotypes are these cognitive boxes.
Yeah.
And they become self-fulfilling because of selective perception.
Selective perception.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically just seeing what you already expect to see.
Yeah.
If your stereotype says Group X is lazy, your brain will highlight every instance that seems to confirm that and just filter out, ignore the times they're being industrious. And that filtering just makes the original stereotype feel more true, harder to shake.
This even works when positive traits are involved. Robert Merton's analysis is interesting here. He looked at perceptions of different groups, like Lincoln versus, say, Jewish or Japanese communities at the time. The content of the stereotype, like being ambitious or shrewd, could be the same, but the feeling attached to it, the emotional judgment, was totally different depending on if they were seen as in-group or out-group. That's the in-group, out-group bias in action.
We should probably mention the authoritarian personality theory briefly. It's older. It proposed that certain rigid personality types actually needed prejudice psychologically. It was influential, but the sources are pretty clear. The original studies had serious methodological flaws, researcher bias, design issues, so it's historically significant, but not really a go-to explanation now.
Okay, let's shift then. Second category, culturally centered causes. Now, unlike personality traits, these are learned. They come from being socialized in a particular community, a particular culture. And the crucial difference is, because they're learned, they can potentially be unlearned.
Right. We soak these views up from family, school, media, often from a very young age. The sources give a pretty stark example of this cultural influence. A quote from Richard Nixon back in 1973, he was talking about ethnic groups, saying things like, "The Irish can't drink, they get mean," and describing Jews as aggressive and abrasive.
Wow. And hearing that from someone in such a prominent position, it just shows how these cultural narratives get amplified and normalized, doesn't it? It doesn't even matter if the individual fully believes it. It becomes part of the cultural background noise.
It really does. But what's fascinating is the gap that can exist between that background cultural belief and what people actually do. The sources talk about how intimacy or lack of it affects prejudice. Generally, more distance equals more prejudice. Yet there's this surprising story from the 1950s.
Oh, the journalist traveling with the Chinese couple. Yeah, tell us about that.
Right, so this journalist traveled across the U.S. with a Chinese couple during a period of pretty high anti-Chinese sentiment. Despite the prevailing prejudice, they were only actually refused a hotel room once on the entire trip. But, and this is the twist, when the journalist went back later and surveyed those same hotels, asking hypothetically if they'd accommodate Chinese guests, the vast majority said no, they wouldn't.
So what people say they believe or what they think the social norm is can be totally different from their actions when faced with a real person.
Exactly. It suggests the threshold for acting discriminatory might be different, perhaps lower when it's abstract versus face-to-face. It's a really interesting disconnect.
Okay, final category. Social conflict-centered causes. This view argues prejudice isn't just about personality or culture. It stems directly from competition between groups, and it serves as a way to justify the resulting inequality, the social hierarchy.
This is essentially realistic conflict theory. Groups are competing for scarce resources. That could be jobs, land, political power, even just social status. And that competition itself ramps up hostility and negative stereotypes about the rival group. If you reduce the competition, the theory goes, prejudice tends to decrease.
The classic experiment here is Robber's Cave, isn't it? Where researchers basically manufactured conflict between two groups of boys just by setting up competitive games with limited prizes.
Yes, exactly. It showed how quickly intense hostility and prejudice could be created purely through competition. Wanting to protect your group's resources and status becomes a powerful driver for creating and maintaining prejudice.
Okay, so we have these three lenses: personality, culture, conflict. Where do the sources say we are now? How has this evolved? We know since, say, World War II, overt, openly expressed prejudice has generally declined, at least in many Western countries.
That's true. But the question is why? Has prejudice genuinely gone down, or have people just gotten better at hiding it? Or has it changed form? There is strong evidence linking education to lower prejudice. More education often means more exposure to diverse information, different people, maybe better critical thinking skills.
Which brings up that provocative question again. Are people less prejudiced because they're genuinely thinking more critically? Or have they just learned the socially acceptable answers, learned not to say the quiet part out loud?
And that leads us right into what the sources call modern racism. This form is much more subtle, often based on denial, which makes it really hard to address.
What are the core assumptions of this modern racism, according to the sources?
There are generally three key ones. First, the assumption that significant racial, ethnic, or religious discrimination, well, basically doesn't exist anymore in the country. Problem solved. Second, if there is still inequality between groups, it's seen as the fault of the minority group itself. Lack of effort, cultural deficiencies, something like that, not society structures.
And the third one?
The third assumption is often the most politically potent. It's the idea that things like affirmative action or any kind of preferential treatment are unfair, and that actually the dominant group, usually meaning whites, is now the real victim of discrimination. This denial of ongoing systemic problems makes it almost impossible to even talk about solutions or structural changes.
And this modern framework, this denial, it gets reinforced all the time, doesn't it? Think about after 9/11. There was that initial understandable surge of patriotism, unity, but then pretty quickly that us versus them thinking locked on to anyone who looked like or was associated with the attackers. An entire religious group, an entire ethnic group, stereotyped as inherently radical or dangerous.
And the media plays a huge role here, often unintentionally. How are villains portrayed in TV shows and movies? Are there recurring visual or ethnic cues? These things constantly reiterate stereotypes, even subtly. Prejudice thrives where there's perceived competition for resources, and media can reinforce the boundaries of who belongs and who is the competitor or the threat.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together for you listening. What are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive?
I think first, always keep that distinction clear. Prejudice is the thought or feeling. Discrimination is the action or the system. They're related, but not the same. Second, remember your brain uses these powerful shortcuts like categorization and the other race effect just to manage the world. It's efficient, but it can lead to bias. And third, understand those three main roots: individual psychology, learn cultural norms, and real-world competition between groups. They all play a part.
So as we wrap up, let's loop back to that 1950s hotel story and connect it to today. Remember, face-to-face interactions seem to override the stated prejudice in that specific instance. People were less likely to discriminate against the real individuals in front of them. Yet today, we're constantly bombarded by media reinforcing broad, often negative group stereotypes. Screens often replace face-to-face contact. So here's the thought to leave you with. We know culturally learned prejudice can be unlearned, and we know direct interaction can sometimes disrupt discriminatory impulses. How, then, can we consciously create more opportunities for genuine human-level interaction in our lives and communities, specifically to counter those broad impersonal stereotypes that screens keep feeding us? Could that be a practical way to start chipping away at the system we've just spent time unpacking? Something to think about.